Who did this to you, kid? Wade? Raven? Mercer asked softly as he looked at the skinny boy curled up on the emergency room bed at Santa Fe Hospital. The boy's eyes were black and blue, and one side of his lip was still bleeding under the cold white lights at nearly 3 in the morning. The boy trembled as Raven stepped closer, as if he was more used to expecting punches than kindness. For a few seconds, Noah Bennett just silently stared at the large, heavily tattooed man in front of him, then finally lowered his head and whispered in a hoarse voice, "It's my stepdad, sir." The room immediately fell silent. The social worker Elena Ruiz, standing beside the hospital bed, quietly turned her face away when she saw the old and new bruises covering the boy's arms. Raven felt his chest tighten when he heard the name Noah Bennett, because the boy's biological father, Daniel Bennett, was the man who had died saving his life in Afghanistan 12 years earlier. And right then, Raven knew the promise he had made in front of Daniel's flag-draped coffin had finally come due. Wade Raven Mercer was a 54-year-old biker with a massive build, a thick silver beard, and marine tattoos covering his sun-bronzed arms from the Arizona desert winds. The man lived alone in an old garage in Flagstaff, fixing Harleys by day and riding the long, lonely roads at night as if he had never truly left the war. After the call from Santa Fe Hospital, Raven roared his Harley onto I-40 in the freezing night, the engine's roar echoing across the desert, while memories of Afghanistan returned like ghosts that had never disappeared. He clearly remembered Daniel Bennett lying in the sand and blood, remembered the roar of the military helicopter overhead, remembered how his friend had pulled him out of the line of fire before dying just seconds later. Over 2 hours later, Raven walked into the pediatric emergency room with boots covered in road dust and the weary eyes of a man who had seen too much pain in life. Noah Bennett lay curled up on the stark white hospital bed, his skinny body covered in old and new bruises stretching from his arms down to his back. One side of his lip was still bleeding, and his wrist clearly showed marks from being gripped too hard. Noah flinched every time a man walked past the room door, instinctively shrinking back so quickly that Raven immediately understood this was not a new fear that had appeared after one night. This was the kind of fear that had been nurtured over many years of beatings. Elena Ruiz, the night shift social worker, quietly said that Noah had been apologizing to the nurses for hours, even though they were only changing his bandages or giving him medicine. "The boy keeps thinking everything is his fault," she said softly. Raven stood silent for a few seconds because he had seen that look before. In the mirror, many years ago, when he was still a child living with a violent stepfather who always believed beating was the only way to raise a boy into a man. Noah tried to sit up straight as Raven approached, even though the pain made his face turn pale. The boy didn't want to look weak. Raven pulled up a chair and sat down beside the bed, then asked in a low, slow voice, "Who did this to you, kid?" Noah kept his head down for a long time, before finally whispering in a hoarse voice, "It's my stepdad, sir." The room fell silent. Noah told them it had all started just because he accidentally spilled coffee in his stepfather's patrol car. Curtis Hale had dragged him into the garage and beaten him for nearly an hour because he thought the boy was too soft to become a man. Raven clenched his jaw so tightly that the muscles bulged under his sun-tanned skin. "Why didn't you call the police?" he asked. Noah looked up at him with the empty eyes of a child who had grown too familiar with despair. "He is the police," the boy replied softly. Elena showed Raven Noah's medical records, which were full of hospital visits for falling down the stairs, school accidents, and running into doors. Too many accidents for a 13-year-old boy. "We think this has been going on for many years," Elena said quietly. Noah lowered his head to look at his bruised hands and mumbled, as if confessing a mistake. "I tried to be a good son. I really tried." That sentence hurt Raven more than any war wound he had ever carried. Noah didn't cry. He didn't complain. The boy simply believed it was all his fault. When Raven stood up to step outside and make a call, he suddenly felt Noah's small hand lightly grab the sleeve of his leather jacket. "Sir, will you come back?" the boy asked very softly, as if his whole life had been spent getting used to adults leaving and never returning. Raven looked at the boy for a few seconds, then placed his calloused hand on Noah's shoulder. "Listen to me, kid," he said slowly. "From now on, no one is allowed to hurt you again." Raven walked out of the hospital room in silence, his heavy boots echoing down the cold white hallway of Santa Fe Hospital, while Noah's last words kept repeating in his head like an endless echo. Outside parking lot, The New Mexico night wind blew strongly across the rows of cars covered in cold dew, but Raven could barely feel anything anymore. He stood beside his matte black Harley Road King, pulled out his phone, and opened the group chat for the Iron Saints MC, the motorcycle club that had been with him for nearly 20 years. The group chat was silent for a few seconds before Raven typed a short line. Daniel Bennett's son is in danger. This is family business. He looked at the screen for one more second, then hit send. Less than 10 seconds later, his phone started vibrating nonstop. Boone was the first to reply from Kingman, Arizona. Location? Another biker in Nevada messaged right after. How serious is it? Then a flood of other messages poured in. Raven only replied briefly. The kid is being abused. StepDad is a deputy sheriff. The atmosphere in the group seemed to freeze for a few seconds before messages started appearing even faster. Colt, the former combat medic who had served with Daniel in Afghanistan, immediately said he would call a lawyer specializing in custody cases in Albuquerque before Noah's stepdad reached the hospital. Maria Delgado, the only female biker on the Iron Saints Leadership Council, said she would contact some local reporters because if Curtis Hale was a local cop, he likely had backup in the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department. In just a few minutes, men and women scattered across Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico began dropping everything to prepare to ride. One biker fixing his bike in Tucson sent a photo of his Harley starting up with the message, "For Daniel." Another in Henderson simply wrote, "I'm heading out." Raven stood still in the cold wind, watching the messages appear and feeling as if he had just awakened an entire sleeping army. He remembered Afghanistan years ago, when Daniel Bennett had gone back through gunfire just to pull a wounded Iron Saints member out of a burning Humvee. Daniel was the kind of man willing to die for his brothers. That was why no one in the Iron Saints ever forgot him. And now, Daniel's son was lying in the hospital covered in injuries. Elena Ruiz walked quickly out to the parking lot, clutching a stack of files tightly to her chest against the cold wind. "You need to know this," she said softly. "Curtis Hale just called the hospital. It looks like he's on his way here." Raven lifted his head immediately. "How long?" "Maybe less than an hour." Elena hesitated for a few seconds, then continued. "If he really is a deputy sheriff like Noah said, there's a good chance he'll try to take the boy out of here before we can complete the emergency protection procedures." Raven looked up at the third-floor window where Noah's room light was still on, then sent another message to the group chat. "Need people at the hospital right now. Don't let Hale take the kid." Less than 30 minutes later, the first Harley engine roared outside the hospital parking lot, low and heavy like thunder in the quiet night. Then another, and many more followed, appearing under the dim yellow lights outside the hospital gates. Bikers wearing black leather vests with the Iron Saints patch stepped off their bikes one by one, their faces cold and silent like soldiers advancing to the front line. No one spoke loudly. No one joked. They simply stood there in the cold New Mexico wind, their eyes directed toward the hospital, as if it held the most important thing in the world to them. A few nurses began pulling back curtains to look down at the parking lot in astonishment. Noah was sitting on the hospital bed with the blanket pulled up to his chest. He heard the engine sounds coming from outside and slowly got out of bed, his body still in so much pain that he had to hold on to the wall to stay standing. Noah gently pulled back the window curtain and froze when he saw dozens of bikers standing out in the cold at nearly 4 in the morning just to protect him. In his 13 years of life, he had always thought adults only appeared when they wanted to yell, beat him, or leave. But now, out there were big tattooed men standing between him and the person he feared most in the world. Noah gripped the edge of the curtain tightly in his trembling hands. While down in the parking lot, Raven looked up at the third-floor window and knew that from this moment on, Curtis Hale would never be allowed to touch that boy again. The sound of Harley engines still echoed in the hospital parking lot when a black SUV sped through the emergency entrance at nearly 5 in the morning. The vehicle braked hard, tires screeching on the dew-wet pavement, immediately drawing the eyes of all the bikers standing outside. The car door flew open, and Curtis Hale stepped out in his deputy sheriff uniform, his name tag still gleaming under the dim yellow lights. The man was in his mid-40s, tall and strong, with a military-style short haircut and the cold stare of someone more used to giving orders than listening. The gun on his hip and police badge made several nurses near the entrance instinctively step aside. Curtis barely looked at anyone as he strode straight into the hospital, but his eyes paused for a few seconds when he saw dozens of bikers in black leather vests standing silently in the parking lot. The atmosphere changed instantly. The bikers said nothing, simply standing there with a terrifying calm, as if they had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. Curtis walked quickly to the nurse's station, pulled out his leather wallet, and slammed his badge down on the counter. "I'm Curtis Hale, Noah Bennett's legal stepfather," he said in a cold, controlled voice. "I'm here to take the boy home." The night shift nurse looked awkwardly toward Elena Ruiz, who had just walked over from the end of the hallway. Elena stayed calm and said that Noah was still under observation for his injuries, and the hospital could not discharge him at this time. Curtis immediately changed his tone, harder and sharper. "Don't you understand the situation? I am the boy's legal guardian. I have full authority to decide." He leaned down over the counter, his eyes full of pressure making the young nurse almost unable to look him in the face. "Or is this hospital trying to teach me how to raise my kid?" Elena took a deep breath and replied that the hospital had a duty to report when they suspected a minor was being abused. Just hearing the word abuse, Curtis's face hardened. "Abuse," he sneered coldly. "He spilled coffee in my patrol car and got punished, that's all. A son needs discipline to grow up." At the same time, on the third floor, Noah was curled up on the hospital bed when he heard the familiar voice echoing from the end of the hallway. All the color drained from his face instantly. Noah clutched the blanket so tightly, his fingers turned white, his breathing becoming rapid and chaotic, as if his body reacted before his mind could process what was happening. No, he's here," the boy stammered in panic. The sound of Curtis's leather shoes grew closer and closer, making Noah almost unable to breathe. He instinctively curled up tighter against the head of the bed, the reflex of a child who had grown too used to waiting for beatings. Elena had just stepped into the room when she saw Noah shaking so violently that the bed trembled slightly with each breath. "No, look at me," she said, quickly trying to keep her voice calm. "You're safe." But Noah only kept shaking his head. "He's going to take me back? Please, don't let him take me back." Elena turned to look at Raven, who had just walked in behind her. Just seeing the boy's eyes at that moment, Raven felt the rage inside him surge so strongly that his jaw clenched in pain. He turned and walked straight out into the hallway, just as Curtis was approaching the room. The two men stopped facing each other in the cold white hallway of Santa Fe Hospital. One was a deputy sheriff in a neat uniform with a gun on his hip. The other was a large biker in a road-dusted leather jacket with eyes as cold as stone. Neither spoke for the first few seconds. Curtis was the one who broke the silence first. "You're Raven Mercer?" he asked in a voice full of contempt. Raven didn't answer right away. He simply stood there, his broad shoulders blocking the doorway to Noah's room like a steel wall. Curtis glanced at the tattoos on Raven's neck and sneered. "I heard the kid called a bunch of bikers in the middle of the night. What a great choice." Raven still didn't move. "He didn't call a bunch of bikers," he replied slowly. "He called family." Curtis let out a dry laugh and took another step closer. "The kid needs discipline, not some guys in leather playing hero." He pointed toward the hospital room. "Noah is too soft. I'm trying to teach him to be a man." Raven stared straight into Curtis's eyes for a few seconds before replying in a deep, low voice that seemed to drop the temperature of the entire hallway a few degrees. "A real man doesn't beat children." That sentence made the air freeze instantly. A nearby nurse almost held her breath. Curtis sneered, but his eyes began to show clear anger. "You don't know anything about raising a son." Raven took another step closer until the two men were only inches apart. "I know enough to understand that a child shouldn't tremble when he hears your voice." Right then, more Harley engines roared outside in the parking lot. Curtis turned his head to look through the glass at the end of the hallway, and for the first time, his expression changed. Dozens more bikers had just arrived at the hospital gates, each stepping off their bikes in silence and forming lines under the cold New Mexico sky. No one shouted. No one caused trouble. But their presence made the entire hospital sink into a suffocating tension, as if a storm was drawing very near. Curtis looked at the scene, then turned back to Raven, his eyes no longer completely calm. And Raven remained standing guard in front of Noah's door, cold as the last sentry before the battle line. Curtis Hale had just turned his head to look down at the parking lot when another series of Harley engine sounds rang out from outside the hospital gates. The deep, heavy rumble echoed through the freezing night of Santa Fe like endless, rolling thunder. One by one, the motorcycles entered the hospital grounds. their headlights cutting through the thin morning mist before lining up in long rows that completely blocked the main entrance. Less than 20 minutes later, more than 80 Harleys of various colors were parked tightly together in front of the hospital, creating a scene that nearly paralyzed the surrounding neighborhood. Residents in the area began stepping out onto their porches, standing and watching the unprecedented large group of bikers with eyes full of both curiosity and worry. A delivery truck driver stopped his vehicle across the street just to take out his phone and record a video. A young nurse said in a trembling voice that she had never seen so many bikers appear at once in her life. On local social media, the first clips began spreading at a dizzying speed. "What the hell is happening at Santa Fe Hospital?" One person posted on Facebook along with a video of the long line of Harleys covering the parking lot. Just minutes later, hundreds of shares appeared below. Some people thought it was a biker funeral. Others thought there was a riot. But then the images of the bikers standing silently in long rows under the cold sky began to make everyone realize this was something entirely different. No one was shouting. No one was causing trouble. No one was drinking or making a scene. They simply stood there like a living wall of leather, steel, and silence. Each person wore a black vest with the Iron Saints patch, hands tucked into pockets or crossed over their chests, eyes directed toward the hospital entrance as if they were all guarding something more important than themselves. Boone stood at the front with his silver beard swaying slightly in the cold wind. Maria Delgado was on the phone while scanning the surroundings like a commander preparing for battle. Colt and several other bikers stood by the emergency entrance, blocking the space between the hospital doors and the parking lot without needing to say a single word. It was precisely that silence that made the scene so terrifying. On the third floor, Noah stood hidden behind the window frame with the hospital blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He looked down at the dozens of large, heavily tattooed men standing out in the cold just before dawn, there only to protect him, and could hardly believe it. In his 13 years of life, Noah had never thought anyone would stand on his side. Adults had always been people who gave orders, made threats, or caused him pain. But now, down in that parking lot were complete strangers who were willing to ride across state lines in the middle of the night just because of one cry for help. Noah gripped the edge of the curtain tightly in his trembling hands as a strange feeling slowly spread through his chest. A feeling he had never experienced before. Safety. Down in the hallway, Curtis Hale was also looking through the glass at the end of the ward, but his expression could no longer maintain its absolute calm as before. He was used to people falling silent when they saw the police badge on his chest, used to his words being the final order. But now, out there were more than 80 bikers who showed no fear toward him. Curtis realized the situation was spiraling out of control faster than he had thought. "Are you turning this into a circus?" Curtis turned to Raven, his voice low and gritted. Raven did not answer immediately. He simply stood blocking the door to Noah's room like a cold steel wall, then said slowly, "No, you did that when you beat a child." That sentence made Curtis' jaw twitch with anger. But before he could reply, the sound of television station sirens rang out from outside the hospital gates. A KRQE-TV van had just sped into the parking lot, followed by two more local news vehicles. Maria Delgado smirked slightly when she saw it. She had called the media right after leaving Albuquerque. Just a few minutes later, reporters began setting up cameras right in front of the long line of Harleys parked densely at the hospital entrance. A female reporter wearing a thick coat stood before the camera, her voice full of tension as she reported live that more than 80 bikers had gathered at Santa Fe Hospital to protect a 13-year-old boy believed to be the victim of domestic abuse involving a local deputy sheriff. Questions began pouring in throughout the hospital lobby. Who beat that child? Why hasn't the hospital discharged him? What does Deputy Sheriff Curtis Hale have to do with Noah Bennett's injuries? Curtis stood frozen for a few seconds when he heard his own name echo from the TV screen near the reception desk. He began to understand that this was no longer confined to a closed family matter. It had become a story the entire city of Santa Fe was watching. And out there, the long line of Harleys still stood silently under the gradually brightening New Mexico sky like a warning that, for the first time in many years, Noah Bennett no longer had to face Curtis Hale alone. The sky above Santa Fe began turning into the grayish blue of dawn, but the atmosphere around the hospital remained taut like before a major storm. The long line of Harleys, continued to cover the entrance while local reporters crowded outside the emergency area, trying to capture images of the bikers protecting an abused boy. Curtis Hale stood at the end of the hallway with an increasingly displeased expression as he continuously received calls from the sheriff's department. He tried to maintain his composure, but his eyes began to show clear frustration of a man who, for the first time, could not control the situation as he wished. At that moment, the elevator doors opened, and a woman in her late 30s stepped out quickly, wearing a dark gray coat and clutching cold eyes and decisive steps made the entire hallway fall nearly silent as she walked straight toward Raven. "I'm Camille," she said curtly, then held out the stack of documents. "Emergency protective custody for Noah Bennett. I called the on-duty judge on the way here." Raven looked at the thick file in her hand and nodded in thanks. Curtis immediately stepped forward, his face icy. "Who are you?" he asked in a voice full of pressure. Camille calmly turned to look at the badge on his chest and replied, "The attorney representing the interests of the child you beat until he had to be hospitalized." That sentence made several nearby nurses hold their breath. Curtis sneered coldly. "You should watch your words." But Camille did not back down. She opened the file and spoke clearly enough for the entire hallway to hear. "Cracked ribs, multiple old bruises that haven't healed, marks from being gripped on the wrists, and a years-long history of injuries. If you want to call this just discipline, I think the judge would really like to hear your definition." Curtis stepped closer, lowering his voice in a threatening tone. "I'm a deputy sheriff of Bernalillo County. I know exactly how this system works." Camille smirked slightly as if she had heard that line hundreds of times before. "So do I," she replied calmly. "And I've won 3 child abuse cases involving police officers in the past 2 years." That sentence made Curtis fall silent for the first few seconds since he had entered the hospital. But then he immediately pulled out his phone and called someone in the sheriff's department. Less than 10 minutes later, 2 local police officers appeared at the reception desk with awkward expressions. One stepped forward and quietly told Elena that the sheriff's department wanted to delay the custody procedures until there was a full investigation. Camille immediately cut in before Elena could reply. "This child is at risk of continued abuse," she said firmly. "New Mexico state law allows for immediate emergency protective custody in cases with clear signs of danger." One of the 2 officers avoided her gaze and said they were only following protocol. Camille gave a faint laugh. "No, you're following Curtis Hale." The hallway atmosphere became so tense that everyone almost dared not breathe heavily. Raven stood silently observing everything and began to understand that this was much bigger than an ordinary domestic abuse case. This was a battle against an entire system where those with badges always protected each other first. He remembered Afghanistan, remembered the feeling of being abandoned on the battlefield. Because superiors wanted to cover up their mistakes, the system was always the same everywhere. It protected power before protecting the weak. Curtis stepped closer to Raven again, his eyes full of hostility. "Do you think that bunch of bikers out there will change anything?" he asked quietly. Raven looked straight into his eyes and replied, "No, but the truth will." Right then, Noah gently opened the door to the hospital room and stood hidden behind Elena. The boy was still trembling, but for the first time since Raven arrived at the hospital, Noah's eyes held more than just fear. He heard Camille talking to the police, heard how she confronted Curtis without backing down, and for the first time in many years, Noah began to feel that something was changing. Curtis Hale was no longer the most terrifying person in the room. He could no longer silence everyone just with his voice and the badge on his chest. Outside the glass doors, the long line of Harleys still stood silently under the gradually brightening dawn light, while the reporters continued filming and asking questions about Noah Bennett's injuries. Curtis turned to look at the scene with an increasingly rigid expression. He began to realize that this story had spiraled out of his control, and Noah, standing hidden behind the hospital room door, with his hands still trembling slightly, dared for the first time to think of something he had never believed could happen before. Perhaps this time, Curtis Hale would not win. After Camille Torres left to prepare for the emergency hearing, the hospital hallway finally became a bit quieter, but the feeling of tension still covered everything like a thick, undissipating fog. Curtis Hale had been forced to stay away from Noah's hospital room until the court made a decision, which made his face grow colder and more unpredictable. Raven returned to the hospital room and found Noah sitting right at the edge of the bed with his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes fixed on the floor as if he were trying to make himself smaller so no one would notice him anymore. Outside the window, the first light of dawn began to cover the long line of Harleys still standing silently under the cold New Mexico sky, but Noah barely looked outside anymore. The boy looked exhausted, in the way only children who had lived too long in fear could. Raven pulled up a chair and sat down beside the bed, placed the hot chocolate Elena had just brought in front of Noah, then sat quietly for a few minutes without asking anything. He understood this kind of silence. Sometimes people needed to feel safe before daring to speak the truth. Noah finally picked up the cup with his slightly trembling hands and mumbled a thank you. He drank very slowly, as if afraid of spilling anything else. Raven saw that, and the sharp pain in his chest became even clearer. "What does Curtis usually do when he gets angry?" he asked softly after a long while. Noah was silent for a few seconds before replying in a voice so small it almost blended into the sound of the heart monitor in the room. "He makes me do push-ups." Raven frowned slightly but did not interrupt. Noah continued looking down at his bruised hands. "If I fall down before he allows me to stop, he makes me start over from the beginning." The boy swallowed hard and continued that once Curtis had made him do push-ups in the garage for nearly 2 hours just because Noah's math test score wasn't high enough. When he passed out on the cold concrete floor, Curtis only splashed water on his face and made him stand up and continue. Noah recounted everything in a flat tone, as if talking about the weather rather than memories that would make a normal child burst into tears. "Last winter he locked me outside in the backyard," Noah continued without lifting his head. "Just because I broke a glass." Raven felt his own hands clench so tightly that his knuckles ached. Noah said that day the temperature had dropped very low. He had to huddle on the porch for nearly 3 hours while Curtis turned off all the lights in the house and left him out in the cold. "He said a man must endure his pain," Noah whispered. "He hated it when I cried." That sentence left Raven speechless for a few seconds. Noah continued that Curtis always said crying was a sign of weakness, that a real son must learn to endure without complaining. Once Curtis had slapped Noah just because the boy cried when he fell off his bike. Another time he made Noah stand in front of the mirror and repeat the sentence, "Don't be weak like a woman," until he memorized it. Raven sat quietly, listening to every word, and gradually felt as if he were looking back at his own childhood. He remembered the old trailer in Texas, remembered the sound of the belt whipping against the wall before it whipped across his body, remembered the drunk stepfather who always yelled that boys were not allowed to cry. Raven had thought he had forgotten it all, but now every word from Noah brought it all back with painful clarity. Noah lowered his head very low and mumbled, "The thing I fear most isn't the pain." He paused for a few seconds, as if trying to find the right words. "I just don't want to disappoint others." That sentence nearly took Raven's breath away for a moment. Noah wasn't afraid of being beaten. He wasn't afraid of the wounds on his body. What he truly feared was not being good enough to be loved. That was a deeper wound than any bruise a doctor could see. Raven looked at the skinny boy curled up on the hospital bed and, for the first time in many years, understood why he had ridden through the night to get here without hesitation. He wasn't just seeing Daniel Bennett's son in this room. He was seeing himself from many years ago, a child who once believed pain was something he deserved. The hospital room fell silent after Noah confessed that what he feared most was not pain but disappointing others. Raven sat motionless for a few seconds, his eyes heavy as if he had just been pulled back to the years he had tried to forget his whole life. But then a soft knock on the door sounded, easing the atmosphere in the room a little. Boone entered first with 2 cups of coffee in his hands and his silver beard swaying slightly as he nodded gently at Noah. Following him were Colt and Maria. No one entered with the loud or frightening demeanor Noah had once imagined about bikers. They moved slowly, spoke softly, and always kept enough distance so the boy wouldn't panic. Boone placed a paper bag on the table beside the bed and said in a hoarse voice, "The pancakes in the hospital cafeteria are terrible, so we bought real food for you." Noah lifted his head slightly, surprised to see hot sandwiches and a can of chocolate milk inside the bag. He mumbled a thank you and secretly glanced at the tattoos covering Boone's arms. Before, Noah had always thought men like them were dangerous. Curtis used to say bikers were just criminals addicted to alcohol and violence. But right now, that big man with scarred hands was carefully placing napkins on the table for him, as if afraid he would burn himself. Colt pulled up a chair and sat near the window, resting both hands on his knees. "When I was your age, I used to sleep in the back of a truck all summer," he said suddenly. Noah looked up at him for the first time since they had entered the room. Colt shrugged as if it was no big deal. "My stepdad drank every night. Every time he got drunk, I would run outside before he started smashing things." Colt gave a faint smile and continued that there were nights he had to sleep, curled up in the bed of an old pickup truck, behind the junkyard just to avoid being beaten. "The smell of motor oil and the freezing cold," he said, "but it was still better than being inside the house." Noah stared at him silently for a long time. There was something in Colt's eyes that made the boy understand the man wasn't lying. Boone let out a hoarse laugh and pointed to the scar running down his temple. "I got this when I was 12, he said. "My biological father threw a beer bottle at my head because I lost the car keys." Maria stood leaning against the door, arms crossed, looking at Noah for a few seconds before speaking. "A lot of people out there think we join a motorcycle club because we like fighting," she said. "But actually, most of us came here because we never had a real family." That sentence made Noah frown slightly, as if he had never thought of it that way. Raven sat beside the hospital bed and looked around at his brothers before saying slowly, "Many bikers out there grew up in houses where screaming rang out every night. Some were beaten. Some were abandoned. Some had no one at all." He paused for a few seconds, then continued in a deep, low voice. "When we found each other, we realized we understood each other's pain better than anyone else." Noah lowered his head to look at the can of chocolate milk in his hands. He had never seen men talk about pain like this. Curtis had always said real men must stay silent and endure. But now, those big tattooed men were talking about their childhoods without any shame. Boone pulled up a chair and sat by the window, smiling lightly. "Truth is, we're all just broken kids who grew up." The whole room chuckled softly for the first time that night. Even Noah's lips curved slightly before he realized what he had done. Raven saw that, and the heavy feeling in his chest eased a little. Noah began to see those bikers differently. They no longer looked like the terrifying monsters Curtis had once described. They looked like men carrying scars on their bodies and in their hearts, but still trying to become better versions of themselves. Colt suddenly took an old military coin from his pocket and placed it on the table beside Noah. "Daniel once saved my life in Kandahar," he said, "so now we're here for you." Stared at the coin for a very long time, his eyes reddening, but he still tried not to let the tears fall. Raven understood what he was doing. Noah was still fighting against what had been drilled into his head for so many years. That crying was weakness. But this time, for the first time in his life, he no longer had to fight alone. The rare laughter in the hospital room quickly faded when Maria's phone rang continuously in her leather jacket pocket. She glanced at the screen for a few seconds, then quietly cursed before stepping closer to Raven. "Curtis has started fighting back," she said softly, but loud enough for Boone and Colt to look up as well. Maria opened a local news station live stream on her phone. On the screen, Curtis Hale was standing in front of a row of microphones outside the hospital with a cold, controlled expression in his neat deputy sheriff uniform. Behind him were 2 local police officers and several people from the sheriff's department. "This is an extremely dangerous situation," Curtis said, in front of the cameras in a firm voice as if he were the victim. "A group of bikers with ties to a motorcycle gang has surrounded the hospital and is pressuring to keep a child away from his legal family." Noah, who was sitting on the hospital bed, immediately stiffened when he heard his stepfather's voice coming from the phone. Curtis continued by saying that Raven Mercer had a history of violence and that the Iron Saints were a motorcycle gang known for threatening behavior. Maria turned off the video, but it was already too late. Noah immediately lowered his head, his hands gripping the edge of the blanket so tightly they trembled. At the same time, out in the hallway, the atmosphere in the hospital began to change noticeably. More local police officers appeared in the emergency area, contemptuously talking with hospital administrators with tense expressions. A young officer stepped forward and demanded a list of all the bikers present on the hospital grounds. Another said that the sheriff's department was concerned about the risk of disturbing public order. Boone let out a cold laugh when he heard that. "We're standing outside smoking more quietly than your lawyers," he muttered. But Raven understood exactly what was happening. Curtis was trying to turn this story into a confrontation between the police and a biker gang instead of a child abuse case. If successful, public opinion would start forgetting about Noah and only focus on the image of men in leather vests filling the hospital entrance. A hospital administrator appeared with 2 security guards and spoke privately with Elena in a voice full of pressure. Elena turned back with a clearly tense expression. "They want to reduce the number of bikers outside, she said quietly. "The sheriff's department is applying pressure because they believe the situation could escalate." Colt smirked slightly. "Escalate?" he said. "We haven't even raised our voices once." But Raven knew it wasn't that simple. Curtis had the badge, the connections, and an entire system behind him. He knew how to manipulate the media and make others suspicious of the Iron Saints even before the truth was clarified. Less than an hour later, more news reports began appearing on the TV in the hospital waiting area. One news channel broadcast images of the long line of Harleys with a red ticker running below. Biker gang confrontation at Santa Fe Hospital. A host even questioned whether Raven Mercer was illegally interfering with the custody of a minor. Noah heard it all. He sat silently on the hospital bed, his face growing paler with every word coming from the screen. "I'm sorry," he suddenly said very softly. Raven turned to look at him. "I don't want to cause trouble for everyone." Noah lowered his face. "If it weren't for me, they wouldn't be calling you criminals." That sentence made the entire room fall silent. Raven felt something tighten in his chest. Noah truly believed all of this was his fault. The boy looked at the Harleys outside, at the bikers standing guard in the cold, and thought he was ruining their lives. "Curtis says always anyone who gets close to me ends up in trouble," Noah continued in a trembling voice. "He says I ruin everything." Raven walked over and sat down in front of the boy, pulling the chair closer. "Listen to me, kid," he said slowly. Noah looked up with fearful eyes. "No one out there is being forced to stay," Raven continued. "They came here because they wanted to." Noah still shook his head very slightly, as if he couldn't quite believe it. Raven sighed and pointed toward the window, where the long line of bikers still stood under the gradually brightening New Mexico sky. "Those people have lost brothers on the battlefield," he said. "They've been abandoned. They've been beaten like you, and none of them wants to see a child go through that alone." Noah stared silently down at the parking lot for a long time. Out there, Boone was handing hot coffee to a younger biker. Maria was still talking to reporters while Colt stood with his arms crossed by the emergency entrance like a sentry. No one had left. Even though the media called them a gang, even though the police were starting to apply pressure, even though Curtis Hale was trying to turn them into the villains in front of the entire city of Santa Fe. And for the first time, Noah began to feel that perhaps Curtis had been wrong about one thing. Not everyone who entered his life would leave when things got difficult. The second night at Santa Fe Hospital passed in a much heavier and more exhausting atmosphere than before. The Iron Saints bikers continued taking turns standing guard in the parking lot. But the media and pressure from the sheriff's department made everything feel more like a prolonged siege than protecting an injured child. The news reports on TV kept repeating the phrase, "biker gang," while Curtis Hale continued appearing before the cameras with the face of a father whose son had been taken from him. Noah heard nearly all of it. Even though Raven and Elena tried to turn off the TV whenever a new report came on, the boy still sensed the wary looks from some nurses and the whispers in the hallway. The feeling of guilt began to grow inside Noah like a heavy stone pulling him down bit by bit. Close to midnight, a cold rain suddenly poured down on Santa Fe, each drop hammering against the hospital windows, while most people had wearily dozed off in the waiting area. Raven was talking with Camille Torres about the hearing the next morning when Elena walked over quickly with a pale face. "Noah is gone." Those 4 words made Raven immediately jump to his feet. Noah's hospital room was empty. The window was still slightly open, and the hospital blanket lay fallen on the floor. No one had seen him leave because Noah had waited for the exact moment of the shift change. Raven ran straight down to the parking lot in the rain, his heart pounding with the instinct of a soldier, all too familiar with losing people on the battlefield. "Spread out and search the area," he shouted to the Iron Saints. Within minutes, dozens of bikers had roared off on their bikes, spreading out across the rain-soaked streets around downtown Santa Fe. Raven rode his Harley through the streets near the hospital, his headlights sweeping across gas stations, bus stops, and closed awnings in the middle of the night. He understood this kind of runaway, Abused children often believed that disappearing would make things easier for everyone else. Nearly 40 minutes later, Raven spotted a small figure huddled under the shelter of a bus stop about a mile from the hospital. Noah was hugging his knees tightly to his chest. The oversized hoodie Boone had given him earlier was completely soaked from the cold rain. He kept his face buried toward his hospital shoes, which he hadn't had time to change out of. Raven turned off the engine and walked slowly closer. He didn't yell. He didn't bombard him with questions. He simply stood in the rain for a few seconds before taking off his heavy leather jacket and draping it over Noah's shoulders. The boy flinched and trembled slightly, but didn't pull away. "I'm sorry," Noah said immediately in a choked voice. Raven sat down beside him on the freezing metal bench of the bus stop. "Why did you run away?" he asked gently. Noah remained silent for a very long time. The sound of rain falling on the pavement echoed steadily around them. Finally, he mumbled, "I don't want to cause trouble for everyone anymore." Raven didn't respond. Noah continued looking down at his hands. "Curtis is right," he said softly. "Anyone who gets close to me ends up suffering." That sentence made Raven feel a sharp pain in his chest in a way he hadn't been prepared for even after going through war. Noah told him that his biological mother used to leave for days every time Curtis got angry because she couldn't stand the arguing. A neighbor who had once tried to intervene moved away just a few months later. Noah's old teacher had once reported his injuries, but never mentioned them again afterward. "No one stays for long," Noah whispered. "Everyone eventually leaves." Raven looked at the skinny boy huddled inside the oversized leather jacket and remembered himself at 12 years old, also sitting under the shelter of a bus stop in Texas, thinking that if he disappeared, maybe things would be easier for everyone around him. He took a deep breath and turned to Noah. "Listen to me, kid," Raven said slowly. "You don't have to earn the right to be protected." Noah looked up at him for the first time since Raven had arrived. The boy looked confused as if he had never heard anyone say that before. Raven continued in a low voice amid the cold rain. "A child doesn't need to be perfect to deserve love, doesn't need to be strong to deserve protection, and doesn't need to endure pain to prove he's a man." Noah bit his lower lip hard, his eyes reddening but still trying not to cry. Raven placed his calloused hand on the boy's shoulder and pointed toward the dark road ahead. In the distance, the Harley headlights of the Iron Saints were still moving through the streets, searching for Noah in the cold rain. "See that?" Raven said softly. "No one's leaving." Noah stared at those lights moving through the rain for a long time, and for the first time in many years, he allowed himself to believe, even if just a little, that maybe he truly no longer had to face everything alone. After the night Noah ran away in the cold rain in Santa Fe, Camille Torres decided it was no longer safe for him to stay at the hospital. The media was growing in numbers, the sheriff's department kept applying pressure, and Curtis Hale clearly wouldn't stop just because of a hearing waiting ahead. Near dawn, Noah was secretly taken out of the hospital through the back door, while several Iron Saints bikers blocked the reporter's view outside. Raven carried him on his Harley Road King through the rain-soaked streets of Santa Fe, his old leather jacket covering most of Noah's body like a heavy blanket smelling of motor oil and cigarette smoke. At first, Noah sat very stiffly behind him, his hands not daring to touch Raven, as if afraid he would do something wrong. But when the bike sped away from the hospital lights and the noisy media sirens behind them, the boy finally held on to Raven's jacket lightly to keep his balance. About 40 minutes later, the group of Harleys stopped in front of a low red brick building on the outskirts of Albuquerque. On the door hung the silver-winged skull emblem of the Iron Saints MC. Noah looked at the old wooden sign by the entrance and swallowed nervously. Curtis had once said a biker clubhouse was full of drugs, alcohol, and violence. But the moment he stepped inside, Noah was almost stunned with surprise. The first smell he noticed wasn't gunpowder or beer, but grilled meat and hot coffee. An older biker was standing at the stove flipping pancakes in a pan, while two others argued loudly about last night's football game. In the corner of the room, Boone and a few older bikers were playing poker and laughing loudly like regular uncles at a family gathering. No one was yelling at anyone. No one was smashing anything. There was none of the fear Noah had mentally prepared himself for. A bald biker who saw Noah immediately pulled out a chair and placed a plate of hot eggs and bacon in front of him. "Eat up, kid. You're as skinny as a nail," he said before turning back to continue arguing with Boone about the right Texas way to grill meat. Noah sat silently for a few seconds, as if he didn't understand what was happening. He had never seen older men treat each other so kindly. In Curtis's house, men had always meant shouting, slamming doors, and violence. But here, those big, tattooed men were passing each other the ketchup bottle, roaring with laughter over a lost hand of cards, and arguing over who made worse coffee. Raven sat down next to Noah and nodded toward Boone. "That old man once fought a vending machine because it swallowed his $2, he said quietly. Noah let out a small reflexive laugh before immediately stopping, as if surprised at himself. But Raven had seen it, and that was the first time he had heard the boy laugh since meeting him. After breakfast, Colt took Noah to the garage behind the clubhouse, where dozens of Harleys were disassembled under old yellow lights. The smell of motor oil, hot metal, and rock music playing from an old radio made the place feel more like Raven's garage than any criminal den Curtis had ever described. Colt tossed Noah a small pair of gloves and pointed to a Harley Sportster sitting on a lift. "Want to learn how to change the oil?" he asked. Noah hesitated for a few seconds, then nodded very slightly. Colt didn't mock him when Noah dropped the tool the first time. He simply calmly picked it up and showed him again how to loosen the bolt under the oil pan. "Machines are just like people," Colt said, while wiping oil off his hands. "If you keep too much dirt inside for too long without changing it, eventually it breaks." Noah listened attentively to every word. For the first time in his life, a man was teaching him something without yelling or threatening. No one called him weak when he made a mistake. No one hit him on the head for being slow. Boone even walked by and handed Noah a can of soda, muttering, "Don't let Colt teach you too much." He once blew an engine just because he forgot to add oil. The whole garage burst into loud laughter while Colt cursed back at him. Noah stood in the middle of that laughter and chatter, his hands covered in motor oil and his face, for the first time, no longer tense with fear. He began to realize that the strangest thing about this place wasn't the Harleys or the Iron Saints tattoos. It was the warm feeling of a real family, something Noah had never had before. The afternoon at the Iron Saints clubhouse passed more peacefully than anyone had expected. Noah sat next to Colt in the back garage, carefully wiping the motor oil off his hands with an old rag, while Boone and several other bikers argued loudly about who made the best chili in New Mexico. For the first time in many years, Noah began to relax his shoulders instead of always tensing up as if waiting for a sudden blow. But that short-lived peace was quickly shattered when Raven's phone rang continuously on the wooden table in the middle of the clubhouse. He glanced at the screen and immediately stood up to step out onto the porch. It was Elena Ruiz. Just hearing her voice, Raven knew something had happened. "The files are gone," Elena said straight away without beating around the bush. The afternoon wind blew strongly across the dirt lot in front of the clubhouse as Raven pressed the phone tighter to his ear. "What do you mean?" he asked. Elena lowered her voice. "I just accessed the hospital data again, and Noah's old CPS reports. Part of the files have been deleted from the system." Raven was silent for a few seconds. "That's impossible. I thought so too," Elena replied quickly. "But the 3 previous injury reports on Noah are no longer there. Some files have completely disappeared, and the rest have been edited to normal household accidents." A cold anger began to rise in Raven's chest. This was no longer just a violent stepfather trying to cover up his actions. Someone was helping Curtis Hale clean up the traces behind him. Elena continued that a doctor who had noted suspected abuse 2 years ago now denied ever writing that report. "People are scared," she said softly, "or being forced to stay silent." Raven turned his head to look through the clubhouse glass door, where Noah was sitting next to Colt, intently watching the Harley engine that had just had its cover removed. The boy had no idea that for many years, his cries for help had been erased by adults as if they had never existed. Less than 10 minutes later, Camille Torres also arrived at the clubhouse with an unusually heavy expression. She placed a stack of documents on the table and pulled up a chair to sit across from Raven. "I think we're dealing with something much bigger," she said directly. Camille said she had just checked the internal records of the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department and discovered that Curtis Hale had been accused of domestic violence twice before. But both cases were closed after just a few days due to lack of evidence. One case was reported by a neighbor after hearing a child screaming, Camille said. The other was from Noah's former teacher. Raven felt his jaw clench until it hurt. "And both disappeared?" Camille nodded. "Someone in the system is protecting him." Right then, Raven's phone rang again from an unknown number. He answered, but the other end was silent for a few seconds before a woman's voice spoke very quietly. "Are you Raven Mercer?" The woman did not introduce herself. She spoke quickly as if afraid someone might overhear. "I'm a dispatcher for the sheriff's department." Raven immediately stepped farther away from the clubhouse door. "What do you want?" "I just want you to know Curtis Hale hasn't done this for the first time." The afternoon wind blew strongly across the lot full of Harleys as Raven listened to every word. The woman said there had been many 911 calls from Curtis's house over the years, but most were canceled before police arrived. A few young officers had tried to report it, but their superiors told them to drop it because Curtis had a good record and knew many people in the department. "Once an officer saw Noah with blood all over his face," she said softly, but the report disappeared the next day. Raven felt a chill run down his spine. The dispatcher continued that recently Curtis had even bragged that he controlled everything because no one wanted to go against a longtime deputy sheriff. "I can't say more," she whispered, "but you should be careful. They will try to make you guys the bad guys before the truth comes out." The call ended quickly before Raven could ask anything else. He stood silently on the porch for a few seconds, eyes on the long line of Harleys parked densely in the dirt lot in front of the clubhouse. Those bikes had initially only come here to protect a child from a violent stepfather, but now everything was different. This was no longer a battle within a family. This was a battle against an entire system protecting itself. Camille stepped out and stood beside Raven, her eyes darkening as she listened to him recount the secret call. "I've seen this before," she said quietly. "Some police departments will do anything to keep their image clean. If Curtis falls, many others will be dragged down with him." Raven looked inside the clubhouse again. Noah was smiling very faintly as Boone pretended to curse Colt for spilling oil on the floor. The boy had finally begun to feel safe after many years of hell, and now Raven understood one thing clearly. If they lost, Noah would not only be sent back to Curtis Hale, the boy would be returned to an entire system that had silently watched him be destroyed for years. That night, while Noah had fallen asleep on the old couch in the clubhouse with Maria's blanket draped over him, the outside world began to explode in a way no one could control anymore. The video of the long line of Harleys standing silently in front of Santa Fe Hospital had already spread beyond New Mexico hours earlier, but by night, it began spreading across America at a dizzying speed. A TikTok account posted a clip less than 30 seconds long, showing more than 80 bikers standing in the cold just before dawn with the caption, "Bikers protecting an abused kid from his cop stepdad." Just hours later, the video had reached millions of views. On social media, people began sharing images of the biker wall as a symbol of protection and rebellion against the system. Some national news channels started replaying the clip in their evening programs. The image of men in leather vests standing guard in front of the hospital doors under the dim yellow lights of a New Mexico dawn felt both cinematic and intense, making it hard for anyone to look away. But along with that spread, public opinion also began to split into two clear sides. One side called the Iron Saints heroes, protecting a child when the system had failed. The other side believed Curtis Hale's words and thought a biker gang was trying to steal a child from his legal family. On the TV hanging in the corner of the clubhouse, a silver-haired host was arguing fiercely with a former state prosecutor about whether Raven Mercer was illegally interfering with custody rights. Boone cursed and muted the TV but couldn't stop everyone's phones from ringing non-stop with messages and social media notifications. Maria sat in front of her laptop reading every article with a tense expression. "This is going beyond New Mexico now," she said quietly. "CNN just mentioned the case." But what surprised Raven the most came the next morning. Another video began spreading online from the account of a former Marine in Texas. The middle-aged man in an old military jacket looked straight into the camera and said, "I served with Wade Mercer in Afghanistan. If Raven says that kid is in danger, I trust him with my life." After that video, a series of other veterans began speaking up. One who had served with Daniel Bennett posted an old photo of their unit in the Kandahar desert with the caption, "Daniel died to save his comrades. Now they're saving his son." A veterans group in Arizona even publicly supported the Iron Saints and demanded an independent investigation into Curtis Hale. The story gradually changed. It was no longer biker gang versus deputy sheriff. It became a confrontation between those who believed the system was covering up violence and those who wanted to protect the reputation of law enforcement at all costs. Meanwhile, Curtis Hale began losing control faster than anyone imagined. A secretly recorded video outside the hospital appeared online, showing Curtis yelling at a reporter and shoving the camera to the ground. The news station immediately replayed the footage all day. Comments that had once supported Curtis began to shift. Some former neighbors in Bernalillo County also started appearing online, saying they had heard screaming from Curtis's house for years, but no one dared intervene because he was a cop. The sheriff's department tried to issue an official statement saying Curtis Hale has not been charged with any wrongdoing, but it only made the public more suspicious. Curtis no longer appeared with the calm demeanor he had at the beginning. A local reporter captured footage of him slamming his car door and yelling into his phone right in front of the sheriff's department headquarters. A source even said Curtis had stormed in and argued with his superiors because he felt they weren't protecting him strongly enough. Raven followed it all from an old chair in the clubhouse, feeling the weight in his chest growing heavier. He understood very clearly the kind of desperation that comes when people begin losing control. They would become more dangerous than ever. Noah was sitting on the garage floor with Colt changing spark plugs on an old Harley when he heard the sound of the TV coming from the main room. He lifted his head to look at the screen where the long line of bikers under the dawn light appeared again with the words, "The Biker Wall." Noah stared for a long time, his eyes full of confusion. "All those people came because of me?" he asked softly. Colt wiped the oil off his hands and replied simply, "Yeah." Noah lowered his head for a few seconds as if he still couldn't comprehend the feeling. In his 13 years of life, he had always thought he was something people wanted to stay away from. But now, the whole of America was looking at his story. And for the first time, Noah began to realize that what Curtis Hale feared most was not the Iron Saints, not the media or the court, but the truth finally being seen. The night before the hearing in Albuquerque was as heavy as a storm about to hit. The New Mexico sky was covered with dark clouds and the desert wind blew strongly around the Iron Saints clubhouse, making the old metal signs creak in the yard. In the main room, the TV continued broadcasting news about the biker wall and Noah Bennett's case, but no one was really paying attention anymore. Everyone could feel that something was approaching. Near 10 o'clock at night, Maria's phone rang from source inside the sheriff's department. After reading the message, her expression changed immediately. "Curtis is drunk," she said quietly to Raven. "He just caused trouble at a bar near Bernalillo County and drove off." Boone cursed under his breath. Maria continued, "The source says he's asking about Noah's location." The entire room fell silent instantly. Raven stood up from the old wooden chair and looked around the clubhouse. "Set up an outer perimeter," he said shortly. No one asked anything else. Just seconds later, the bikers began putting on their jackets, checking flashlights, and stepping out into the freezing night. Dozens of Harleys were pulled into a circle around the clubhouse like a living steel fence. Boone and two older bikers stood guard near the main gate with hunting shotguns slung behind their backs, even though no one really wanted to use them. Colt checked all the windows at the back of the garage while Maria made continuous calls to track Curtis's SUV location. The atmosphere was as tense as before a military ambush. But this time, what they were protecting was not a base or a military convoy, but a 13-year-old boy sleeping on the couch in the next room. Noah woke up near midnight from a familiar nightmare. He sat up abruptly in the darkness, breathing hard and panicking. So much it took him a few seconds to realize he was no longer at Curtis's house. The sound of wind hitting the windows, mixed with the footsteps of bikers patrolling outside, made Noah even more panicked. He pulled the blanket tight around himself and heard Curtis's angry shout echoing in his head as if real. "Get up, you weakling!" Noah almost didn't realize he was shaking until Raven stepped into the room. He had just finished a patrol around the clubhouse, his leather jacket still carrying the cold of the night wind. Raven didn't turn on the full light, only pulled up a wooden chair and sat down beside the sofa where Noah was curled up. "Nightmare?" he asked softly. Noah didn't answer right away. He only nodded very lightly and quickly wiped his eyes as if ashamed that he had been scared. Outside, the short roar of a Harley engine starting and then stopping sounded as one biker changed position. Noah listened to that sound for a few seconds before mumbling, "Is he going to come?" Raven looked at the boy and slowly nodded. "Possibly." Noah lowered his head toward his hands. I don't want everyone to be in danger because of me. Raven sighed softly and leaned back in the chair. When I was your age, he said slowly, I used to sleep with a knife hidden under my pillow every night. Noah looked up in surprise. Raven was silent for a few seconds as if choosing how much to tell. My stepfather drank every night, he continued. Every time I heard his truck in the driveway, I would start shaking. Noah looked at him more intently than ever. Raven gave a faint smile, but his eyes held no humor. I used to be very afraid of men, he admitted. Afraid of loud voices, afraid of footsteps, afraid of the sound of a door opening. Noah was silent for a few seconds, then mumbled, But you're not afraid anymore. Raven looked out the window where Boone was standing guard under the yellow light in the yard. No, he replied softly. I'm still afraid? Noah frowned in confusion. Raven rested both elbows on his knees and looked down at the old floor of the clubhouse. The only difference is that now I don't run away anymore. That sentence made the room fall into a long silence. Noah had never heard an older man admit he had once been afraid. Curtis had always said real men didn't know fear. But Raven was different. He didn't try to act invincible. He simply sat there in the darkness, telling the truth in the calm voice of someone who had lost too many years learning how to survive. Outside the clubhouse, the wind still blew strongly through the Harley parked densely in the yard like a steel wall protecting the small house in the desert night. Noah pulled the blanket tighter around himself and asked very softly, Why are you still here? Raven turned to look at him. Because back then no one stayed for me, he replied. And I won't let that happen to you. Noah said nothing more. He simply sat quietly listening to the footsteps of the bikers patrolling outside, listening to the wind hitting the old metal roof, and for the first time in many years, he no longer felt completely alone in the darkness. The next morning, the atmosphere in the Iron Saints clubhouse was slightly lighter after the long, tense night. Curtis Hale had not shown up as everyone feared, though several bikers still took turns standing guard around the property from before dawn. Noah woke up on the old sofa with a strange feeling he almost didn't recognize right away. He had slept straight through for nearly 5 hours without jolting awake from shouting or slamming doors. When he stepped out of the main room, Noah smelled fried bacon and hot coffee spreading throughout the clubhouse, while Boone stood at the stove flipping pancakes with an overly serious expression. If anyone burns this batch again, I'll kick them out of the club, he muttered, making several bikers behind him burst into loud laughter. Noah stood frozen for a few seconds at the scene. Those big, heavily tattooed men were arguing about breakfast like regular uncles in a family rather than any of the terrifying images Curtis had drilled into his head. Boone saw Noah and pointed the spatula toward the dining table. Sit down, kid, before these guys eat your share. Noah hesitated for a few seconds before pulling out a chair and sitting down very quietly as if still afraid of taking up too much space. But no one yelled at him for being slow. No one got annoyed when he accidentally spilled a little syrup on the table. Maria even handed him a paper towel and continued reading the newspaper as if it was completely normal. After breakfast, Colt took Noah back to the garage behind the clubhouse again. The morning sunlight shone through the dusty windows, creating golden streaks on the concrete floor covered in motor oil. Today we're changing spark plugs, Colt said, and tossed Noah a hand towel. At first, Noah was still very tense every time he held a tool. He always waited for shouting if he did something wrong. But Colt only calmly guided him again whenever Noah got confused. No need to be fast, he said. Get it right first. Noah began to relax gradually when he realized no one would get angry if he took longer than others. By midday, he had successfully removed the first spark plug without Colt's help. Boone walked by, looked at the Harley, and nodded with mock seriousness. At least it hasn't exploded yet, he said, making the whole garage laugh. And this time, Noah laughed for real. Not just a slight curve at the corner of his mouth that disappeared immediately like before. It was a short, reflexive laugh that surprised even himself. The whole garage fell silent for a second before Boone slapped Colt hard on the shoulder. The kid finally figured out you're not as scary as your face. Noah lowered his head in embarrassment, but was still smiling. Raven had been leaning against the garage door for some time without anyone noticing, quietly watching the scene with a slightly lighter feeling in his chest. He had never seen Noah laugh like a real child since that night at the hospital. In the afternoon, some bikers took Noah out to the yard behind the clubhouse to play football with an old, worn ball. At first, Noah just stood and watched, hands stuffed deep into his hoodie pockets, as if he didn't believe he was allowed to join. But Boone threw the ball toward him without warning, making Noah instinctively catch it. "Not bad, kid?" Boone laughed loudly. Another biker immediately yelled that Boone threw like his grandmother. Less than 10 minutes later, Noah was running across the dusty red yard with the big tattooed men, pretending to fight for the ball like children. Laughter rang out across the land behind the clubhouse, making it feel like a real home for the first time rather than a shelter. Raven stood on the old wooden porch, watching Noah running breathlessly among the bikers, and could hardly recognize the boy who had once curled up on the hospital bed just a few days earlier. What caught his attention most was not Noah's laughter. It was the moment the boy fell to the ground after slipping and did not immediately curl up to cover his head out of fear of being hit like before. Noah simply lay there laughing breathlessly in the dust while Boone jokingly cursed that he ran worse than a 60-year-old man. And right then, Raven understood that the most important thing was finally happening. Noah Bennett was beginning to feel safe. Not completely. Not enough to erase all the fear in his heart, but enough for a child who had lived his whole life on guard to dare laugh loudly among other men. To Raven, that was almost a miracle. The morning of the hearing day, the sky over Albuquerque was covered in a heavy, cold gray, as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The Iron Saints Harley convoy ran in a long line down the avenue, leading to the Bernalillo County Courthouse, under the gaze of dozens of residents and reporters who had been waiting since early. Noah sat behind Raven on the matte black Road King, his hands lightly holding on to the man's leather jacket instead of tensing up in fear like in the first days. But Raven could still feel the boy trembling, not from the cold, but because today Noah would have to face Curtis Hale for the first time since that night at the hospital. When the biker group stopped in front of the courthouse steps, the sound of camera shutters immediately rang out nonstop. Reporters crowded together, asking questions about the biker wall case and the child abuse allegations involving Deputy Sheriff Curtis Hale. Boone and several other bikers quickly created a clear path so Raven could bring Noah inside without cameras being shoved in his face. But the moment they stepped through the courthouse security doors, Noah froze immediately. Curtis Hale was already there. The man stood at the end of the hallway in a dark suit instead of his police uniform, next to an expensive silver-haired lawyer and nearly half a dozen local police officers standing and talking with cold expressions. Just seeing Curtis, Noah's entire body reacted instantly. His shoulders stiffened, his breathing became rapid, and his hand unconsciously gripped Raven's jacket sleeve as if he had turned back into the child who had curled up on the hospital bed that night. Curtis saw Noah and smirked slightly. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly how much fear he had once caused in others. "Noah," he called in a calm voice as if nothing had happened. "Are you really going to do this?" Raven immediately stepped slightly in front of Noah, but Curtis continued looking straight at the boy. "You know these people are using you, right?" he said louder, loud enough for those around to hear. "You're letting a bunch of bikers turn you into a joke on TV." Noah immediately lowered his face. Raven clearly felt the boy starting to tremble harder. Curtis knew exactly how to manipulate Noah. He didn't need to yell or threaten openly. Just making the boy feel weak and guilty was enough. A real son doesn't run off crying to strangers. Curtis continued in a voice full of contempt. "I tried to teach you to be stronger than that." Boone stepped forward, as if about to charge at Curtis, right there in the courthouse hallway. But Raven raised a hand to stop him. He bent down to Noah's level and said very softly, "Don't look at him." Noah swallowed hard but couldn't stop shaking. Raven placed his large, calloused hand on the boy's shoulder and led Noah straight past Curtis without another word. But Curtis's gaze still followed the boy throughout the entire hallway like a freezing hook. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The back rows of seats were nearly full with people who had arrived early, mostly reporters, veterans, and Iron Saints bikers. On Curtis's side, quite a few local police officers also appeared with a clear expression of protecting their colleague. Noah sat next to Camille Torres in the front row, his two hands clasped together so tightly they turned white. Raven sat right behind him like a silent wall. The hearing began with a stern voice of the elderly judge, but almost immediately Curtis's lawyer tried to turn the case into a custody dispute inflated by the media. He described Curtis Hale as a model deputy sheriff trying to raise a child with Behavioral issues. Every time he heard those words, Noah lowered his head further, as if he truly believed he was the cause of everything turning bad. But then Camille stood up, not loudly, not dramatically, just calmly opening the thick stack of files and placing it on the table in front of the judge. "This is not an ordinary family dispute," she said clearly. "This is a years-long child abuse case." The entire room immediately fell silent. Camille began presenting each of Noah's medical records: a broken wrist at age 10, a mild concussion at age 11, multiple hospital visits with reasons like falling down the stairs and household accidents. She also presented reports that had been deleted from the system but were partially recovered by Elena from backup data. Some images of Noah's injuries appeared on the screen, causing many people in the courtroom to turn their faces away. Noah kept his head down in his seat as if ashamed that everyone was seeing his wounded body. Camille continued in an increasingly sharp, cold voice. She presented the canceled 911 calls, the reports that disappeared from the sheriff's department, and the statement from the secret dispatcher about Curtis Hale being protected by his superiors for years. The atmosphere in the courtroom began to change noticeably. A few police officers sitting on Curtis's side could no longer maintain their initial confidence. Neither could Curtis. He still tried to keep a cold expression, but his jaw began to clench when Camille mentioned each piece of evidence with terrifying accuracy. Then Camille paused for a few seconds before saying the sentence that left the entire room deathly silent. "The most heartbreaking thing," she said slowly, "is that this child has never once said he hates his stepfather. Noah Bennett only keeps apologizing to everyone because he thinks he is not good enough to be loved." Noah immediately bit his lower lip hard, his eyes reddening but still trying not to let the tears fall. Behind him, Raven clenched his fist so tightly that his knuckles turned white. And for the first time since entering the courtroom that morning, Curtis Hale began to look more like a man gradually losing control than the deputy sheriff who had made an entire family terrified for years. The atmosphere in the courtroom remained heavy as lead after Camille Torres presented the full file of Noah Bennett's years-long abuse. Reporters at the back of the room kept taking notes, while a few police officers sitting on Curtis Hale's side began avoiding each other's eyes. But Noah could barely hear any sound around him anymore. He only felt his heartbeat pounding hard in his chest, and Curtis's gaze still fixed on him from across the courtroom. The judge looked down at the file for a few seconds, then asked in a low voice if Noah wanted to say anything. The entire room immediately fell into suffocating silence. Noah stiffened in his seat. He had never been allowed to tell the truth before. Every time he tried to open his mouth, Curtis always made him believe it was betrayal, weakness, and his own fault. Noah felt his hands starting to shake violently under the table. Curtis saw that and immediately spoke first. "You don't need to do this anymore, Noah," he said in a fake calm voice. "You're just being manipulated by these people." Noah immediately lowered his head according to his old reflex, but then Raven gently placed his hand on the back of the boy's chair, not pressuring, not saying anything, just being there like a reminder that this time Noah was not alone. The boy took a deep breath and slowly stood up. The entire courtroom nearly held its breath, watching the skinny 13-year-old boy trying to keep his knees from shaking. Noah didn't look at anyone except Curtis. "You told me a real man must endure pain without crying," he began, in a voice so small that many people had to lean forward to hear clearly. Curtis's expression changed immediately. "No, you said if I cried then I was weak," Noah continued, this time a little clearer. "You made me do push-ups until I passed out. You locked me outside in the winter. You beat me for spilling coffee, for not getting high enough test scores, for being too loud in the house." His voice began to shake harder with each sentence, but Noah still didn't sit down. "You always said it was to teach me to be a man." Curtis immediately jumped up from his seat. "He's lying," he shouted, startling the entire courtroom. "He's just a spoiled brat brainwashed by those bikers." Two police officers immediately grabbed Curtis's shoulders as he tried to step toward Noah. But what stunned the entire room was not Curtis's anger. It was that Noah did not curl up like every other time. The boy still stood there, his face pale but his eyes, for the first time, not looking down at the floor. Curtis continued in a gritted voice. "You're ruining my life just because you want attention." Noah breathed heavily once. He was clearly still afraid. Raven saw it through the boy's trembling hands and tense shoulders. But then Noah did something no one in the room thought he was brave enough to do. He lifted his head and looked straight at Curtis Hale, really looked straight at him, for the first time in many years. The entire room fell completely silent. "I used to think it was all my fault," Noah said slowly, his voice hoarse from trying to stay calm. "I thought if I was better, stronger, then you would stop beating me." Curtis sneered coldly with contempt. "You really are as weak as I always said." But this time Noah did not lower his head. He looked straight at the man who had made him terrified throughout his childhood and said in a voice not loud, but clear enough for every person in the courtroom to hear, "A real man doesn't beat children." No one moved for a few seconds after that sentence. No sound of papers turning, no camera shutters, no chairs shifting. Only heavy silence covered the courtroom. A female reporter at the back of the room covered her mouth with her hand. Boone lowered his face as if trying to hide his reddening eyes. Even a few police officers on Curtis's side no longer looked toward him. Curtis stood frozen in the middle of the courtroom, his face flushed red with rage but unable to say another word. Because for the first time his greatest power had disappeared. Noah was no longer afraid of silence. The boy was still shaking, tears finally spilling from the corners of his eyes, but he didn't turn away, and that made Curtis look smaller than ever. Raven sat behind Noah, feeling his chest tighten as if being squeezed. In that moment, he no longer saw the boy curled up on the hospital bed in Santa Fe. He saw Daniel Bennett's son, the soldier who had once charged into gunfire to save his comrades without hesitation. Daniel had died like a brave man, and now his son was doing the same in his own way. Raven involuntarily remembered the night many years ago beside the flag-draped coffin when he had promised to protect the boy if anything happened. Back then, Noah was just a child he had never met, but now, watching Noah stand in the middle of the courtroom with trembling shoulders, yet refusing to bow his head before the man who had destroyed his childhood, Raven knew how proud Daniel would be of his son. The courtroom remained submerged in heavy silence after Noah Bennett's words. Curtis Hale stood frozen in the aisle, his face burning red with anger while every eye in the room no longer looked at him as a powerful deputy sheriff. For the first time since the case began, Curtis looked more like a man gradually losing everything than someone controlling the game. Noah slowly sat back down in his seat, his hands still shaking, but his eyes different from before. He no longer kept his head down toward the floor like a child waiting to be punished. Raven sat behind him, looking at the boy, the tightness in his chest still not gone. On the other side of the courtroom, Curtis's lawyer tried to stand up and object, saying Noah's statement was emotionally influenced and affected by the media, but even his voice now lacked its initial certainty. Camille Torres immediately stood up and countered with a series of injury records, reports deleted from the system, and testimony from the sheriff's department dispatcher. Each piece of evidence presented was like another hammer blow to the wall Curtis had built around himself for years. The elderly judge remained silent for a very long time, before taking off his glasses and looking straight at Curtis Hale. The court finds sufficient grounds to believe that the minor Noah Bennett faces a serious risk of abuse if returned to the current guardianship environment. His voice was low and decisive, making the entire room nearly hold its breath. From this moment, the court issues an emergency protective custody order for Noah Bennett until the investigation is complete. A few sighs of relief came from the Iron Saints row. Boone lowered his head into his large hands as if trying to hide his emotions. Noah blinked rapidly for a few seconds as if he hadn't fully understood what had just happened. He didn't have to go back to Curtis anymore, at least for now. But it didn't end there. Right as the judge was about to close the hearing, the courtroom door suddenly opened, and two men in dark suits. One showed a badge to the court clerk and said something quietly. Camille turned and immediately understood what was happening. "Internal Affairs," she said softly to Raven. The news spread through the room in just seconds. The Sheriff Department's Internal Affairs Division had finally officially stepped in. One of the two investigators stepped forward and announced that Curtis Hale was under investigation for allegations of child abuse, falsifying reports, and obstructing the evidence preservation process. Curtis immediately jumped up from his seat. "Are you kidding me?" he growled. "After all these years of service?" But this time no one looked at him like a hero in uniform anymore. And what really made Curtis start to panic was what happened next. A young police officer sitting at the back of the courtroom slowly stood up, then another. They looked at each other for a few seconds before one spoke up, saying he had once received a call from Curtis's house 2 years ago, but was told to drop the report. Another officer admitted he had seen Noah with bruises on his face, but his superior said, "Don't get involved in Hale's family business." Those confessions rang out in the silent room like stones, finally cracking the last protective shell around Curtis. For many years, the silence of those around him had helped him survive. But now, once the first person dared to speak the truth, the others could no longer continue pretending. Curtis looked around the courtroom with eyes that could no longer maintain their cold control as before. He looked like a man desperately trying to hold on to power that was slipping from his grasp bit by bit. "You're destroying me just because of a kid's words," he shouted. But this time, no one responded. No one defended him. No one stayed silent out of fear anymore. The hearing ended amid the sound of camera shutters and the rush of voices in the courthouse hallway. When Curtis stepped out with his lawyer, dozens of reporters immediately surrounded him with questions about the abuse allegations and evidence concealment. As Curtis tried to push through the crowd, with a face flushed red with rage, 2 internal affairs investigators stepped forward to block his path. One demanded that Curtis immediately surrender his weapon and badge during the investigation. Curtis laughed in disbelief and took a step back. "You can't do this to me." But the other investigator had already taken out the handcuffs. The entire area in front of the courthouse immediately fell silent. Cameras all turned toward Curtis Hale as the deputy sheriff, who had made an entire family terrified for years, was turned around and handcuffed right in the cold afternoon sunlight of Albuquerque. Noah stood behind the courthouse glass door watching the scene and could hardly breathe. Curtis Hale was finally no longer the most terrifying person in his world. And for the first time in his life, Noah Bennett saw someone who had done bad things truly face consequences. The plaza in front of the Bernalillo County Courthouse gradually quieted down after Curtis Hale was led away in handcuffs. But the heavy feeling from the past many days still had not completely disappeared from Noah Bennett. He stood next to Raven among the long line of Harleys parked under the pale afternoon sunlight of Albuquerque. His hands still stuffed deep into his hoodie pockets, as if his body had not yet gotten used to no longer having to be afraid. Reporters were still standing across the street, continuing to talk about the case that was shaking the entire country. But this time, Raven did not let Noah walk through the crowd of cameras and shouting voices. He simply handed the boy a helmet and nodded toward the matte black Road King that was already idling. "Let's go home, kid." Noah paused slightly when he heard those 2 words. Home. He had never truly known what that felt like. But he still slowly climbed on behind Raven, his hands hesitating for a few seconds before lightly holding on to the man's leather jacket. Just minutes later, the Iron Saints Harley convoy began leaving Albuquerque in a long line, the sound of their engines echoing throughout the street like deep rolling thunder on a desert afternoon. Boone rode parallel on Raven's left, while Maria led the group at the front. People on both sides of the road began stopping to watch the dozens of bikers in black leather ride through the city, with an American flag fluttering on a few bikes at the back of the convoy. Some people raised their phones to record videos. A few veterans standing in front of a roadside diner even raised their hands to salute Raven when they recognized the Iron Saints patch on his jacket. But Noah barely noticed any of it. He sat behind Raven, listening to the steady rumble of the engine beneath him and feeling the desert wind blow past his shoulders. It was the strangest feeling he had ever experienced: peace. The convoy merged onto Route 66 as the sun began to sink toward the Arizona horizon, painting the long road in brilliant orange-red light. The distant mountain ranges gradually turned deep purple, while the shadows of the bikers stretched long across the pavement like an old caravan crossing the American West. Noah had never traveled far beyond the routes Curtis patrolled, but now, sitting in the middle of the endless line of Harleys, under the sunset sky, he felt for the first time that the world could be much bigger than that fear-filled house. They stopped for gas in a small town near Gallup. An old woman selling souvenirs recognized Raven from TV and gave Noah a free cold can of soda and a still hot apple pie. "You're safe now, son," she said gently, before turning away to quickly wipe her tears as if she didn't want anyone to see. Noah stood holding the soda can next to the old gas pump, watching the bikers laughing and talking around their dust-covered Harleys with a strange yet warm feeling in his chest. No one yelled at him for standing slowly. No one got angry when he accidentally dropped the can lid on the ground. Boone even bent down to pick it up and grumbled that he was old, so his knees hurt more than that lid. Noah laughed out loud before he could stop himself, and this time he didn't feel guilty for it. When the convoy continued on the road, the sky gradually darkened and the desert air grew colder. Noah sat behind Raven for nearly another hour before exhaustion finally overcame the vigilance that had clung to him for so many years. At first, his head only lightly touched Raven's back for a few seconds before jerking up by reflex. But Raven said nothing. He simply kept a steady speed, the Harley rumbling evenly like a low, calm heartbeat in the night. And then, for the first time in many years, Noah fell asleep behind a man without fear of being woken by shouting or violence. His hands unconsciously gripped Raven's jacket tightly while he slept soundly, while Raven glanced at the boy's reflection in the rearview mirror and slowed down a little to make the ride smoother. Boone, riding beside them, saw the scene and smiled under his silver beard, then quietly spread the convoy out to reduce the noise behind. The long line of Harleys continued gliding along Route 66 under Arizona's starry sky like an old guard escorting a child home from war. Noah slept peacefully behind Raven, while the last nightmares no longer chased him. And somewhere between the sound of Harley engines and the cold desert wind of the American West, Noah Bennett began to believe for the first time in his life that perhaps he truly still had a future ahead. The weeks after the hearing passed much more slowly than the chaotic days before, but they were also the first time in Noah Bennett's life that he began to understand what it felt like to live without constantly being afraid. Under the temporary protective custody order from the court, Noah stayed with Wade Raven Mercer at the Iron Saints clubhouse in Flagstaff, while Camille Torres continued handling the long-term custody procedures. At first, Noah still kept the habit of walking very lightly in the house, eating very slowly, and startling every time someone called his name loudly from the other end of the garage. But as the days passed, his body gradually learned to trust that this place was not like Curtis Hale's old house. Mornings at the clubhouse always began with the smell of strong coffee and the sound of Boone grumbling about someone eating all the bacon before he got to the kitchen. Noah usually woke up very early out of old reflex, but instead of hearing shouting or slamming doors, he only heard old rock music playing softly from the garage and the sound of Harleys being worked on behind the house. Raven did not force Noah to talk much. He simply let the boy ease into the rhythm of clubhouse life, little by little, the way one would repair an old engine that had been running too long without care. Colt continued teaching Noah how to fix bikes almost every day. At first, it was just changing oil, checking spark plugs, or cleaning air filters. But then Noah began to remember the name of each tool and how to disassemble each part on the old Harley Sportster in the garage. Colt was always patient to the point that Noah sometimes couldn't understand why a big, scarred man like him could be so calm with him. Machines don't like being rushed, Colt often said when Noah did something wrong. Neither do people. Boone taught Noah how to grill meat in the backyard of the clubhouse every weekend, though most of the time he just stood drinking beer and pretending to yell because Noah cut the onions as bad as a Californian. Maria helped Noah learn how to answer the phone without panicking every time it rang. Another biker named Hank taught him how to play billiards in the corner of the main room. Those small things gradually filled the emptiness Noah had never had in his childhood. No one called them teaching, but it was the first time Noah was truly growing up around men who knew how to treat others kindly. Raven noticed the change most clearly during dinner times. In the early days at the clubhouse, Noah always ate very quickly, as if afraid someone would snatch the food from his hands. But a few weeks later, he began to stay at the table longer after meals, listening to Boone tell stories from his youth or laughing at the times Colt was teased for blowing an engine. Noah no longer tensed up every time someone walked behind his back. He slept through the night more often, instead of jolting awake from nightmares. One day, Raven even saw Noah fall asleep on the sofa with the TV still on, and his feet propped up on the table, something he had never dared do before because Curtis would always get angry if Noah looked too comfortable. One afternoon, Raven stood in the garage watching Noah, arguing with Boone about which football team was worse this season, and suddenly realized the clubhouse had completely changed. Before, this place had only been a resting spot for old men carrying scars from war and life. But now, amid Noah's laughter, the smell of grilled meat in the yard, and the Harleys lying disassembled under the old yellow lights, this place began to feel more like a real home than any house Raven had ever had. What touched him most was the way Noah began unconsciously seeking out the others whenever something happy or sad happened. When he successfully changed a spark plug for the first time without Colt's help, he immediately turned to look for Raven to show off. When a nightmare woke him in the middle of the night, Noah no longer ran away, but quietly pulled his blanket and sat near the garage where Raven was working late. The boy began to believe that someone would stay if he needed them. One evening at the end of the month, the entire clubhouse gathered in the backyard for a barbecue under Arizona's starry sky. Boone was arguing with Maria about how to grill steak when Noah burst into loud laughter, nearly spilling the soda can in his hand. That laughter rang out across the yard full of Harleys like a sound the place had been missing for many years. Raven leaned against the old wooden railing, watching Noah laugh and joke with the other bikers, feeling the tightness in his chest ease in a way he never thought he could feel again. The Iron Saints had been created by men who no longer had anywhere to belong. But now, for the first time in many years, they were not only saving a child from violence, they were giving the boy a family. And Raven understood that Noah Bennett had finally begun to believe he deserved it. 6 months after the hearing at Bernalillo County, summer had spread its brilliant golden sunlight over the pine forests surrounding Flagstaff, and the Iron Saints clubhouse no longer resembled the cold shelter for scarred men. Laughter appeared more often than arguments, and the smell of barbecue in the backyard had almost become a familiar part of every weekend. That afternoon, dozens of Harleys were parked densely in the dusty rear yard in front of the clubhouse while Boone stood next to the giant grill, flipping steaks and yelling that anyone who touched his sauce would be banned from the state of Arizona. Maria sat on the old wooden railing, laughing so hard she nearly spilled her can of beer, while Colt was arguing with several other bikers about how Noah now changed spark plugs faster than he did. Amid all that laughter and chatter, Noah Bennett was lying halfway under an old Harley in the garage with Raven Mercer. It was the same bike Raven had been working on the fateful night, many months earlier, when Santa Fe Hospital called after 2 a.m. The Harley had remained there throughout that time, like a reminder of the night everything began to change. But now the garage was no longer filled with the heavy atmosphere of the past. Noah had grown a little taller, and the frail, skinny frame from the first day he met Raven was gradually being replaced by the healthy body of a boy who was finally eating and resting properly. The bruises that had once covered his arms and back had long since disappeared, and the eyes that used to fill with panic at the sound of a man raising his voice now only held a very faint trace of wariness. Most importantly, Noah had begun to laugh like a normal child. He slid out from under the bike, his hair smeared with a bit of motor oil, and handed the wrench to Raven with clear pride. "Done," Noah said. Raven checked the part he had just replaced and nodded slightly. "Not bad, kid," Boone, standing outside the garage, immediately shouted in. "Don't praise him too much, Raven. The kid's starting to think he's better than us." Noah burst out laughing and threw the oil-stained rag toward Boone, causing the whole yard to erupt in laughter. Raven stood beside the Harley, watching Noah laugh and joke with the others, feeling a calm in his heart in a way he never thought he could feel again after the war and so many years of living like a shadow. 6 months earlier, Noah had still been the boy curled up on a hospital bed just from hearing a man's voice in the hallway. And now, he was standing in the middle of a group of big, heavily tattooed bikers without any fear. A while later, the sun began to sink lower behind the mountains around Flagstaff, bathing the entire clubhouse yard in the orange-red light of an Arizona sunset. The bikers gathered around the barbecue table in the yard, old rock music playing from the radio next to the garage, while Boone continued arguing loudly about who grilled meat the worst in the club. Noah sat on the wooden step in front of the garage eating a burger with Raven, his legs swinging to the rhythm of the music like a boy who was finally living his real age. Colt had just finished telling a silly story about how Boone once set the entire lawn on fire trying to grill steak with motorcycle gasoline, making everyone roar with laughter. Noah laughed so hard he nearly choked on his soda, then turned to Raven in a more natural reflex than anything he had ever done before. "Uncle Raven," he said while laughing, "is that story true?" That moment nearly made all the sounds around Raven disappear. Boone was still arguing in the yard. The Harleys of a few newly arrived bikers were still rumbling at the gate. Maria was still laughing so hard she was slapping the table. But Raven could no longer hear anything clearly except the two words that had just come from Noah's mouth. Uncle Raven. Not sir, not mister. Not the cautious way a child always afraid of doing something wrong would call him, but the way a child called someone who belonged to their family. Noah seemed to realize what he had just said and paused, his face immediately turning red with embarrassment. I'm sorry, he stammered according to his old reflex. But Raven only stood silent for a few seconds, the innocent throat so strong that he had to quickly turn his face away. In his mind appeared the image of Daniel Bennett many years earlier under the smoky, dusty war sky of Afghanistan. Daniel had charged back through gunfire to pull Raven out of the burning Humvee, even though he himself had been shot. Then, the image of the flak-draped coffin appeared afterward, along with the promise Raven had made in desperation that he would protect Daniel's son if the day ever came. For many years, Raven had always thought he had broken that promise, because he had no idea Noah was living in hell. But now, looking at the boy sitting beside him under the Arizona sunset, healthy, laughing, and no longer afraid when hearing men's voices around him, Raven finally understood that the promise had been fulfilled. He placed his calloused hand on the back of Noah's neck and squeezed gently in the awkward way men often showed affection. "Yeah," Raven replied softly, his voice low. "That story's true." Noah smiled and continued eating his burger while outside in the yard, the sound of Harley engines rang out again as a few more bikers rode into the clubhouse. 6 months earlier, the sound of men speaking loudly, or motorcycle engines, would have made Noah curl up in fear. But now, under the blazing red sky flagstaff, amid the smell of grilled meat, laughter, and the long line of Harleys filling the yard, Noah Bennett only felt safe whenever he heard those engines sound outside his home. If this story makes you believe that kindness still exists out there, please hit subscribe to the channel to join us in the next touching stories about humanity, healing, and bikers with hearts bigger than any road they've ever ridden. Thank you for staying until the end of Noah Bennett's journey, and we'll see you again in the next story, under the sound of Harley engines echoing across the American sky.